Hello all, and welcome to the first of two topic lectures for our general topic today of religion. We will start with religion. So first I want to point out that religion is the state cult. That is the religious practices that were supported and fostered by the Roman government. The Romans had mandated participation in state cult, and failure to observe state cult was seen as a sign of social or political rebellion. So first, the gods of this religion. As Harvey number 227 shows us, the Romans believed that the gods' influence was everywhere. The Romans definitely believed that the gods influence events in the mortal realm, which meant that belief in the gods and their powers was the best way to avoid malevolency. Because of this, Roman religion inculcated the belief that the attitude and actions of mortals toward their deities affected whether the gods would treat them beneficently or cruelly. As Cicero states, gods are the lords and controllers of all things, and whatever happens is done with their plan and power. Because of this, everyone should believe that the gods know what kind of person he is, what he does, what he believes about himself, and how he performs the rites in terms of his mental attitude and devotion, pietas. They should understand that the gods keep account of everyone, pious and impious alike. So let's move on to the big gods of this religion. First up is Jupiter or Jove, who was Greek in the Greek religion, in Greek mythology / religion, Zeus. He is the king of the gods and the god of the sky, lightning, thunder, law, order, and justice. His symbols are the thunderbolt, eagles, bull, and scepter. His wife and sister was Juno, who in Greek was Hera. She is the queen of the gods and the goddess of marriage, women, childbirth, and family. Her symbols include the peacock and the cow. Up next is Zeus's brother, Neptune, or Greek Poseidon. He is the god of the seas, water, storms, hurricanes, earthquakes, and horses. And because of this, his symbols include the horse, the bull, the dolphin, and the trident. Next up is Ceres, or Greek Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, fertility, agriculture, nature, and the seasons. Her symbols include the poppy, wheat, torches, the cornucopia, and pigs. The two gods on your screen now are both related to war in some way. The first is Minerva, or Greek Athena, who is the goddess of wisdom, handicraft, or war strategy. Her symbols include the owl and the olive tree. Her counterpart in war is Mars, who was Greek Ares. He is the god of war, violence, bloodshed, and manly virtue. His symbols include the boar, the serpent, the dog, the vulture, spears, and shields, and is one of two founding gods of Rome in that he is the father of Romulus and Remus. The two gods on your screen now are twin gods. The first is Apollo, or Greek Apollo, Apollon. He is the god of light, the sun, prophecy, archery, poetry, music, medicine, healing, and plague. His symbols include the sun, bows and arrows, the lyre, the swan, and the mouse. His twin sister Diana is known as Artemis in Greek. She is the goddess of the hunt, wilderness, virginity, the moon, archery, childbirth, protection, and plague. Her symbols include the moon, horses, deer, hounds, the she-bear, snakes, cypress trees, and the bow and arrow. Next up is Venus, or Greek Aphrodite. She is the goddess of love, pleasure, passion, procreation, fertility, beauty, and desire. Her symbols include the dove, birds, apples, bees, swans, myrtle, and roses, and she is the second of two founding gods of Rome, and that she is the mother of Aeneas. She is technically married to, though not quite faithful to, Vulcan, who was Greek Hephaestus. He was the blacksmith and craftsman of the gods, the god of the forge, craftsmanship, invention, fire, and volcanoes. His symbols include fire, anvil, axes, donkeys, hammers, tongs, and quail. Next up is Mercury, or Greek Hermes. He is the messenger of the gods, the god of travel, commerce, communication, borders, eloquence, diplomacy, thieves, games, and he is what is known as the psychopomp, or the god who leads the souls of the dead to the underground. His symbols include the caduceus, a stick with snakes wrapped around it, winged sandals, and the tortoise. There's also Vesta, or Greek Hestia, who is the goddess of the hearth, fire, the right ordering of domesticity and family, whose symbols include the hearth and fire. Last but not least, we have Bacchus, or Greek Dionysus, though he was also called Bacchus by the Greeks. He is the god of wine, the grapevine, fertility, festivity, ecstasy, madness, and the patron god of theater. His symbols include the grapevine, ivy, cups, the tiger, panther, leopards, dolphins, goats, and pine cones. And last but not least is Pluto, or Greek Hades, who is the god of the underworld and the dead. His symbol includes the chariot, the serpent, dogs, and pomegranates. He is not technically an Olympian god because he lives in the underworld, whereas the Olympian gods live on Mount Olympus. The assimilation of Latin names to these Greek deities is an example of what we like to call syncretism. Syncretism is the incorporation into a religious tradition of beliefs from unrelated traditions. As I mentioned in our discussion about the Roman military, the Romans liked to use this as a form of control over the people they conquered. Instead of making them change their religion drastically, they just assimilated their gods onto the local deities. Here are a few examples. The big picture you see here is Zeus Ammon, who is Zeus/Jupiter Ammon, who is Jupiter merged with Ammon, an Egyptian god. The small bronze head you see is Sulis Minerva, who is Minerva associated with Sulis, who was a Celtic god. And finally, the dog person is Hermanubis, who is Hermes/Mercury mixed with Anubis, an Egyptian god. But beyond these big main gods, the Romans also preferred to see a multitude of gods presiding over narrow areas of influence. This includes nature. As Seneca says, have you ever come upon a grove full of very old trees that have grown to an unusual height? The height of the trees, seclusion of the spot, and the unusual shadiness, despite the grove being in a relatively open area, should lead you to believe that this grove is indeed the home of a deity, or numen. As Seneca goes on to show, this also happens with caves, sources of rivers, springs, and special pools. This multitude of gods was a feature of Roman religion and was meant to reflect the wide variety of phenomena visible in nature, otherwise known as animism, which is the attribution of divine spirits to natural phenomena, objects, and abstractions. Roman belief that divinity is found in nature is called animism. Because of this, later Christian authors mocked them for the number and specificity of their gods. In this passage from Harvey number 229, we see Augustine trying to unmask the silly nature of Roman gods by describing their extremely specialized roles. He begins with the rhetorical question, how can I fully document the names of all the gods and goddesses in one book? He then goes on to describe all the different gods and goddesses attributed to the multiple different parts of just one sheath of wheat. He states, these people have looked down on the chaste embrace of the one true God and instead chosen to prostitute their miserable souls to a crowd of demons. As a result, they put Proserpina in charge of the ears of wheat when they first begin to sprout. The god Nadutis is in charge of the joints and knots of the stems. Volutina presides over the sheaths that wrap around the wheat itself. When the sheaths open, however, and the ears appear, the wheat is turned over to Patellana. When the stems are as long as new ears, they belong to the goddess Hostilina, because the ancient Romans called this stage hostire. Flora is the goddess in charge when the wheat flowers, flores, Lacturnus when white substance drips from it like milk, lactenscentes, and Matuta when the wheat is mature, maturascentes. When the wheat is taken out of the soil, Runa Contor, it is under the control of Runhina. Now let's go on to see how the Romans would worship all these multitude of gods. So first of all, the big difference between modern religions and ancient religions is that there's no Bible. There's no written text that tells us anything about what they practiced. Instead, the most important thing was communication with the gods. This happened in two ways. Sacra, which were the performance of sacred rites. Sacra were requests to gods for their assistance and included sacrifices and festivals. The other way this was done was through auspicia, which is divination by watching bird flight or examining entrails on sacrificial animals. Within this was also the observance of prodigia or monstra, which were omens that signaled more extreme situations that demanded immediate religious interpretation and action, like a sacrifice. In order to be able to participate in these practices, the participant needed to be pious, which meant having pietas. Pietas was the correct observation of rites and the willingness to accept the god's wishes. If a participant carried out rites with pietas, it was assumed that his request would be granted. Having pietas and having your request granted would then give you felicitas, which is happiness or good fortune, in that the gods would work in your favor. On your screen now, from Harvey selection number 230, we see some examples of auspices, which are priests who take auspicia or bird omens. In this passage, Livy describes a disagreement over the interpretation of auspices. The consul says it is up to the priests, not to him, to interpret. As he says, it is the one who take the auspicia who bear the burden of responsibility. If they make a false report, they will only bring the anger of the gods upon themselves. For my own part, I was told that the chickens ate the food eagerly. That is the most favorable omen for the Roman people and its army. This turns out to be untrue, though, because the chicken keeper who gave him this interpretation is killed in the first battle, and this is seen as the gods bringing their anger for falsely reporting the auspicia. When the fact of the death of the chicken keeper was announced to the consul, he replied, "The gods are participating in the battle. The guilty one has received his punishment." While the consul was saying this, a crow in front of the consul interrupted with a clear caw. The consul accepted this as a good omen and proclaimed that never before had the gods been more involved in human affairs. In this passage, we can see the praise of an emperor for his felicitas and pietas. The writer writes, "Most fortunate emperors, you have conquered with felicitas alone. Is there anything Roman emperors are happier to hear about their own felicitas than to be told that the enemy is quiet, is idle, and cultivates peace? You deserve, O best of emperors, that felicitas because of your pietas." This passage suggests that because this emperor had the good fortune to conquer enemies with peace, he must have felicitas. And therefore, because felicitas comes from being pietas, he must be a pious man. Harvey selection number 232 shows an example of impietas that can help us define what this pietas means. Because the rites had been prescribed by long-standing tradition, any variation, intentional or unintentional, could be used to explain away unexpected or negative results. Even a small mistake in the performance required that the participant restart the rite from the beginning. Much more serious were occasions when a person intentionally did not perform the sacra exactly as tradition had passed them down or ignored the signs of the gods. The Latin term for this crime was impietas, the opposite of pietas. Since, as Cicero pointed out, the gods watch every move and the piety of the people, this whole episode serves as an example of Clodius's impietas. So here are 3 examples from Harvey number 232 that show how impious Clodius was. So first of all, the sacred chickens gave a bad omen when they did not eat their feed. If Clodius had been a pious man, the chickens would have eaten their feed according to Roman religion. Instead of trusting in this omen, Clodius ordered them to be thrown overboard and was heard to exclaim, "If they do not want to eat, let them drink." If he were pious and had pietas, he would have listened to the gods and tried either later than that day or the next day. Finally, because of this, the fleet was defeated in the battle, and inflicted a major disaster upon the Roman people. The opposite of this, pietas, would have been success in battle. Now let's move on to the actual process of ritual and sacrifice. Harvey's selection number 241 notes the importance of prayer. In this, there's a debate. The author is debating whether words have power and uses the importance of prayer and religious ritual as an example of the power of words. He states, if animals are sacrificed without an accompanying prayer, there is the general feeling that the gods have not been consulted correctly. He then goes on to state how precise priests and their attendants were in reciting prayers. He states, they do this to make sure that not one word is omitted or uttered out of place. There is a person who writes the prayer down in a script beforehand. Another person is appointed as a kind of guard to oversee the recitation. And yet a third person demands silence from the crowd. While the prayer is recited, musicians play so that those in attendance hear nothing but the prayer. He then goes on to list two problems with recitation. Either the sounds of a bad omen are heard, or there's an error in the recitation. When either of these two problems happen, it is not unusual for there to also be trouble with the omens of the animal itself. Because of this, if any of these things happened, sacrifice would have to start over in order to ensure pietas. You can see an example of some private agricultural rituals in Harvey number 242, but let's look at an example of a public ritual sacrifice. So sacrifice was the most common and important Roman religious rite. It was an offering made to a particular god or gods on an altar in front of a temple. A priest performed it while observers watched. There were many observers present in addition to priests who would be accompanied by slaves. This was an example of the tenet, I guess you would call it, do et des, which is a Latin phrase that means I give so that you may give. This means that sacrifice represented a contractual relationship between the performer and the god. In order to make the sacrifice really stick, it had to be a financial sacrifice. Whatever was sacrificed had to be a significant financial loss to the one doing it. For lower classes, this meant a cake or something homemade that used the things that they needed to stay alive. For a richer aristocrat or the state, this meant a cow or sheep or some sort of expensive animal. The sacrifice usually had 4 phases. The first was purification. The priest attending the sacrifice had to be ritually clean, not physically clean. This meant not having any blood on him, not having had sex the night before, anything like that. Had to be ritually clean. After this purification happened, there was a procession which led to the altar where the animal would be killed. Once they reached the altar, preparations were made for the actual sacrifice. During these preparations, religious attendants take care of the bull that is to be sacrificed. A musician plays stuff in the background, and the musician will play throughout the whole ritual. The attendants would bring the sacrificial bull forward and sprinkle its head with water and a mixture of grain and salt called mola salsa. And then finally, the animal was killed. It was thought that for a sacrifice to happen properly, the animal had to consent to its death, which means coming calmly and bowing its head. While the priest began to recite the prayer, a victimarius, or one of the attendants, would hold the bull's head still, while the popa, another attendant, knocked the bull on the head with a large mallet. The victimari would catch the head of the bull as it fell, while another attendant, the cultrarius, struck the beast's neck with an axe to release the blood, which was caught in a basin. After the bull had been killed, it was butchered. Some parts of the body were set aside for sacrificing on the altar to the god. Some of the innards, most notably the heart and liver, were taken to the haruspex so that he might inspect them to ensure that the sacrifice was acceptable to the gods. If the haruspex found something amiss in the animal, the sacrifice would need to be repeated. After the animal had been butchered, the priest, attendants, and crowd participated in a dinner with the god. whose statue was often placed upon a couch and positioned in a place of honor at one of the tables. While some of the meat was sacrificed on the altar, the vast majority, including the choicest cuts, were kept for the feast. Now let's talk about the priests who would be in charge of these sacrifices. So the main duty of a priest in Rome was to oversee correct pietas in his duty and the duties of others. Priests therefore performed sacra, led processions, led direct actions, said prayers, while the actual killing of the sacrificial beast was left to slaves. Because of this, he represented the whole Roman state before the gods. But despite this, you'd think that there would be a professional in charge. But really, priesthoods were held by aristocrats, not professionals. Priests were split up into 4 colleges led by the Pontifex Maximus. And on your screen is the statue of Augustus as Pontifex Maximus. So these 4 colleges were the pontiffs, or the pontifices, who presided over state cult in general. The second college were the augurs, who took the auspicia and interpreted the bird omens. Next up were the quindecimviri sacris faciendis, or the 15 men in charge of sacred rites, who would interpret the prodigia, or the omens, and they also were the keepers of the Sibylline oracles, which were a book containing lists of prodigia and the rites necessary to counteract any divine unhappiness the prodigia might reveal. And the final college were the septemviri epulorum, or the 7 men in charge of sacred banquets. They would organize the banquets that happened after the sacrifices. In this description, we can see that these 4 colleges are split in 2, with the pontiffs and the septemviri taking care of the sacra, and the augurs and quindecimviri taking care of the auspicia. So because of this, pontifices have the greatest religious power among the Romans, as Harvey number 233 points out. In this, it states these priests are in charge of the most important affairs. They are the ones who serve as judges in religious cases involving private citizens, magistrates, and anyone involved with religious worship. It is also their duty to investigate the conduct of all of the priests, servants, and attendants who are used in the performance of sacred rites to make sure that no offenses are made against sacred law. And because of this, in the eyes of the private citizens, these are the priests who, as interpreters and teachers, understand the nuances of worship and the gods and noumena. This shows that pontifices, or pontiffs, keep track of the pietas of the state and punish those who do not follow their commands. And even though they are aristocratic men and not professional religious men, they're seen as religious authorities by the people in Rome. Harvey number 234 tells us about another priesthood or priestesshood known as the Vestal Virgins. Vesta presided over the hearth and the home, but she was adopted by the Roman state to protect the hearth of state. The hearth of state was a fire that was kept perpetually burning in a round, hearth-shaped temple in the middle of the forum. As this selection states, the Vestals live in the precinct of the temple. No one wishing to enter their abode is prohibited from doing so during the daytime, but at night it is against the law for any man to enter. The Vestals are required to remain in service for 30 years, during which time they must remain unpolluted by marriage and perform the sacred rites as regulated by religious law. The phrase, they must remain unpolluted by marriage, means that they must remain virgins or not have sex for the entirety of their appointment. These women were allowed to leave after 30 years, but most don't, because they take the misfortunes of those who did leave as a warning and remain in Vesta's service until their deaths, after which new members are chosen by the pontifices to round out the required number. Harvey number 235 gives you some inscriptions of head Vestal virgins from the atrium of Vesta. You can read that on your own, but I just wanted to show you some photos of the atrium and the statues. So the photo on the left is a statue of a Vestal Virgin, and the photo on the right is of the atrium itself. Harvey number 236 speaks about local priests and the imperial cult. So local aristocrats would be the pontifices for their cities or provinces. They also presided over the imperial cult, which was the worship of the emperors. Within the imperial cult, the flamen was the priest. There were individual flamines for the cult of each of the deified emperors. Augustus established that the emperor himself could not be worshipped in Rome, but he didn't stop it from happening anywhere else. This same trend continued with the other emperors. Thus, we see more evidence of the imperial cult in the provinces and other cities than we do in Rome. So that's the atrium. You can see there, so left is the Vestal Virgin, right is the atrium. So here's the imperial cult. The chief flamen was held for life by an aristocrat, while individual cult flamines were young aristocrats at the start of their public careers. And on your screen here is the temple of Rome and Augustus that the man in this selection, number 236, is said to have been flamen of. Finally, let's look at some temples. So what the type of temple you're probably thinking of when you think of Roman or ancient temples are actually Greek temples. They have columns all the way around the building and are decorated on all four sides. Ironically, the most well-preserved examples of Greek temples can be found in Paestum in southern Italy, because southern Italy and Sicily were Greek colonies for a long time. And if you ever get a chance to visit Italy, I suggest you go to Paestum because they do let you walk inside of these, and it's really cool. Roman temples were pretty different. They had a high position. They were rectangular in shape and on a high podia or base. The high position dominated the surrounding landscape and gave priests a better view for auspices. In the front was a deep porch fronted by 1 to 3 rows of columns. So instead of having columns all the way around, they were just in the front. This is, of course, a significant departure from Greek style. The entrance led to the main chamber of the temple, or cella. The cella is where the cult statue would be located. Instead of being inside of the temple, the altar would be placed in front of the temple. This is because sacrifices drew such a crowd that it would be too packed inside the temple for it to work. Generally, though, the altar was in a direct line with the entrance of the cella so that the deity could see it. So on your screen now is an example of a typical temple. This is the Temple of Portunus. It is in the Forum Boarium, which is a livestock market along the Tiber in Rome. As you can see, it has a porch with 4 columns across and then extends back. And they're all are columns on the side, but they are built into the cella, which is hard to see here. This is in contrast to the atypical temple on your screen, which is actually located right next to the Temple of Portunus in the Forum Boarium. This temple, known as the Round Temple, is often associated with Hercules Victor or Hercules the Conqueror, but we don't actually know who it was who it was dedicated to. This temple demonstrates the assimilation of Greek architectural styles because the Greeks were really the only ones who had round temples. This temple was built in the later 2nd century BCE when Rome was conquering the Greek world, hence why the Greek influence. Harvey number 239 tells us a little bit about temple building. The aristocracy was responsible for building, renovating, and restoring temples. This is because maintaining the religious infrastructure was expensive and time-consuming. Roman politicians also helped fund religious buildings. For example, Pompey's theater was built in 55 BCE, included a temple to Venus Victrix, or Venus the Winner, at the top. Augustus is also very proud of building many temples, including the Temple of Apollo next to his house, because he credited Apollo with helping him win at Actium. Building temples was also a sign of a person's pietas, as Pliny shows in Harvey 239. Pliny states, "I think it would not be out of place for me to act generously and reverently with one act by building as beautiful of a temple as possible for the goddess, and at the same time adding a portico in the area in front of the temple for the enjoyment of the people." There are numerous inscriptions commemorating the construction of sacred structures by aristocrats. And in addition to the examples in Harvey number 240, here is a picture of the Temple of Saturn in the Roman Forum. The inscription from the architrave, or that band up top, reads, "Senatus populusque Romanus incendio consumptum restituit," or "The Senate and the Roman people rebuilt this, having been consumed by fire."